Welcome everyone to the Center for Strategic International Studies event. My name is Ilaria Mazzocco. I am a senior fellow and the trustee chair in Chinese business and economics here at CSIS. And today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Joanna I, who will be discussing her newest book, Cooperating for the Climate, Learning from International Partnerships in China's Clean Energy Sector. Before I introduce Dr. Lewis, let me just say a couple of words about the event and the book. So first of all, if you have questions, we do encourage you to submit the questions live. You can do so from our website, from the event page on the CSIS website. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you can go on the csis.org website, find the event page and submit your questions. We will try and address those in the second part of the event. And we do have some great panelists that I will be introducing after Dr. Lewis's presentation. Let me just say something about the book. Just last year, I remember being in a conversation with someone where we were discussing how there seemed to be a lack of really good comprehensive studies of, the positive effects or just the outcomes of collaboration between the U.S. and China on climate. And we were specifically talking about the CERC, the Clean Energy Research Center. Well, this book does that and so much more because it provides actually a framework for understanding China's collaboration well beyond the United States in the climate space. So I think this is not just an important book because of its analysis, which is quite important, but also because of the wealth of data, which I think will be very helpful for a lot of researchers that will be looking at this in the years to come. So let me go ahead and introduce the Dr. Lewis. Joanna Lewis is Provost, Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy and Environment and Director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She has 2 decades of experience working on international climate and clean energy policy with a focus on China. At Georgetown, she runs an active, externally funded research program and leads several dialogues and joint study groups facilitating U.S. China climate change engagement. Dr. Lewis is also a faculty affiliate in the China Energy Group at the U.S. Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. She is the author of the award-winning book, Green Innovation in China, which I think everybody who has done research or studied clean tech supply chains in China has cited. I certainly did in my dissertation, and was a lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 5th Assessment Report. Joanna, I will leave it to you to present your book. We're very excited to hear what you have to say.
Great. Thank you so much, Ilaria. And thank you to you and to CSIS for hosting this event today. And to our distinguished discussants for joining. I really appreciate it. Let me pull this up. The origins of this book really came from my own experience, as you mentioned, sort of working on international partnerships in China's clean energy sector over the last couple of decades. In both the governmental and non-governmental space, and sort of being on the ground and working in China on different projects and starting to sort of think about what makes these partnerships work and why do they sometimes, why are they sometimes less effective? And then, I started to think more about this sort of agenda for collaboration in the years leading up to the 2008 presidential election here in the United States, and was part of a project where we were thinking about how to elevate climate change on the U.S. China bilateral agenda. And so it's this was sort of how I started to think about this topic, and then ended up putting this project together, which really thinks about how we cooperate for the climate in a comparative perspective, and what we can learn beyond the United States. So the framing questions for this project, first of all, the book looks at how countries have been cooperating with China on clean energy and climate change over the last 3 decades. And how do these countries manage the risks and the benefits of such collaboration? And then, I also think it's important to look back at this experience and then help us understand what can we learn from this to inform decisions about bilateral cooperation today. This is, of course, still an active discussion. And so I do hope that there are some lessons learned from this book that can inform current policy discussions, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So, I want to start with what I see as sort of the key contributions of this book. First of all, data. We really didn't have good information on bilateral agreements with China. And so one of the things we did is put together a new database that includes over 400 agreements with 43 countries plus the EU. And this is available, again, for researchers who would like to dive into this more, and is a way to sort of just look at broad trends, right, in the cooperation space. But then, beyond that, I think it's important to look in a lot more detail about how these specific agreements really play out. And so I developed 3 in-depth case studies that look at 3 different clean energy research centers, which I'll talk about shortly. The other contribution is the analysis. So I propose an integrated framework combining the political, economic, and technical factors to help explain the rationale for and the structure of these cooperation mechanisms. And then I also look at how these different programs have been leading us to understand how cross-border clean energy R&D happens and how these models are actually evolving. And then finally, having this sort of international look at cooperation with China, and because China plays such a central role in clean energy technology development and dissemination, we can start to understand how these technologies are likely to evolve and the global role of innovation and cooperation in our low carbon transition. So looking at the trends, it's not surprising that we have just seen an almost exponential growth in the number of bilateral agreements that have been signed with China in the clean energy and climate change space. I think this is both a result of just, global interest in this topic becoming more and more, becoming larger and larger. And then also, of course, China's role becoming more and more central. China is, of course, the largest energy consumer and producer in the world, the largest greenhouse gas emitter. And so really is, the cornerstone of almost every country in the world's bilateral cooperation in the climate and energy space. And so in the book, I look at the role that different countries play and the different technology areas where we see focus of these bilateral agreements. We of course see large countries like the United States sign a lot of agreements, right? They have a lot of bandwidth. There's a lot of agencies involved here. But then you see smaller countries that also sort of punch above their geopolitical weight in this area, like Denmark. And I think, Denmark's a very interesting one. Very small country, but has signed a lot of agreements with China, is very active in this space. And I think that is very much due to the really unique experience that Denmark has with decarbonizing its energy sector and really being one of the few countries in the world that has successfully been able to transition from a primarily fossil fuel-based economy to a low carbon economy. And China very much wants to learn from that, and spreading that experience to the world is sort of very much part of their diplomatic strategy. So, you see these sort of different countries that play important roles across different technologies. Overall, we see that there's quite a bit of cooperation in the energy efficiency and conservation space, as well as in the renewable energy space. And then also in the sort of straight climate change space, which includes cooperation on climate science as well as policy research. And, there's a lot of differentiation within each of these categories. We're talking about many different technologies, and I go into more detail about this in the book. But, we do notice that, for example, there's some technology areas that are only sort of just emerging as areas of cooperation, or where we see sort of less agreements overall. Such as in energy storage and transportation. And I think a lot of this also is due to the fact that we see less cooperation around technologies that still are in the early stages, pre-commercial stage, including carbon capture and sequestration technologies, although there is somewhat of a time element here again, and sort of more interest in this over time. And then I also look at the different modes of cooperation. So, we have many agreements that are, primarily diplomatic agreements. They're focused on dialogues, information sharing, and that tends to be the majority of the agreements that are signed. But then there's also a lot of cooperation with China that focuses specifically on commercial opportunities. So this would include, public-private partnerships, programs that are, interested in helping companies with market access or a variety of other topics. And then there's other partnerships that are focused specifically on the area of collaborative research or development or demonstration projects. And this has been a large focus as well, particularly in certain countries. We see here, the U.S., but also Denmark, the U.K., and others that have really been very active sort of in the technology cooperation space. And then, of course, within specific national contexts, there are evolving political factors that affect sort of when and how countries opt to cooperate on climate and clean energy in general, and then with China specifically. Looking at the United States, the 2009 and the first year of the Obama presidency was really a kind of the banner year for the United States in the history of U.S. China collaboration. The U.S. had been cooperating for decades with China, but this was really sort of the first time that this issue was elevated on the bilateral agenda, and there was just a record number of agreements signed that year. But then we see, of course, during the Trump administration, where climate change was overall less of a diplomatic priority, no new agreement signed between the United States and China for several years. So I want to turn to briefly to the case studies that I mentioned I look at in the book. The first is the U.S. China Clean Energy Research Center, the CERC, and the second is the China National Renewable Energy Center, or CNREC. This is another form of clean energy research center that was that the Danish government set up, and unlike the CERC, which was sort of a virtual partnership involving hundreds of researchers across multiple laboratories, universities, private sector. CNREC is actually was a think tank that was embedded within the Chinese government to try to help inform particularly renewable energy and clean energy policy. And then the third case is the China-Brazil Center for Climate Change and Energy Technology Innovation, or the China-Brazil Center. And this is a really interesting case because it's one of the few that we find where you have sort of another emerging economy working with China in the clean energy space. This is a program that focused on a variety of clean energy technologies, but biofuels in particular was the focus of this. And it was a really unique effort to bring together researchers in both countries, but with a high level sort of diplomatic oversight of this center. And so in the book, I try to sort of talk about how we have this continuum of technological and political benefit across these different agreements, and how this can help us sort of understand how different countries position themselves to work with China, and as well as the outcomes of these initiatives. And so, you can sort of roughly look at the China-Brazil Center, which was a relatively small effort focused on relatively niche technologies, relatively lower political and technological stakes, whereas the CERC was really a highly ambitious effort that could potentially, with the goal of having very high technological benefit, technological focus, as well as political benefit. The agreement was actually used to leverage other high-level diplomatic outcomes, including the Paris Agreement in the international climate negotiations. And then I also look at how we can understand the specific projects within these partnerships and map them along a continuum of research, development, demonstration, and deployment, because we see different projects have this different focus at these different stages of technology development, and that also affects how you structure these agreements as well as their outcomes. And so, within specific projects of the CERC, we would see, for example, a specific technology or application that was developed in the United States, which is the blue. It would then be brought to China for demonstration, scaling, and then ultimately deployed when it reached sort of commercial scale in both countries. There were some projects that were actually jointly developed by both countries and then brought back to each of the home countries, the U.S. and China, for demonstration and deployment. In the Brazil Center, we see this sort of interesting model where you actually had a Chinese invention as opposed to sort of it coming from the partner country. There was a biofuel technology which was developed in a lab in China, and the inventor sort of realized that this had a lot of potential, but not necessarily within the Chinese context. And so specifically brought this technology to Brazil for demonstration, given the extensive experience with biofuel technologies there, set up demonstration projects and retrofitted other projects. And that allowed this technology to be commercialized and ultimately deployed in both national contexts. And so this allows us to think also about, again, this sort of mapping of international cooperation on clean energy technologies. This is just a subset of the countries examined in the book, but this helps us, again, start to understand, all these countries are sort of contributing to clean energy innovation across these different technologies. They're partnering with China strategically in different areas, again, partly in line with their national interests, but also their own domestic expertise or their own national needs in this area. And so we can sort of look at this and understand the different contributions to the deployment of these technologies and sort of where this might be headed in terms of the broader innovation trajectories in these technologies. Again, because China plays such a central role in the global manufacturing and deployment of almost all of the clean energy technologies listed here. So just to wrap up with some of the key findings of the book, I find that China has in fact been the primary target of international clean energy cooperation over the last few decades. But of course, this is beginning to change. And again, not just here in the US, but in many places because of rising political and economic tensions. I find that bilateral cooperation takes place along this continuum of political and technological benefit. And that really varies quite a bit by country. And there's some distinct differences, which I think can help us really understand how different countries evaluate these programs. We certainly have seen less cooperation in clean energy technology areas that are key for the low carbon transition, driven by competitiveness concerns. And this does shape how countries set their agenda for bilateral cooperation and how China does as well. And I get asked a lot, again, so we sign all these MOUs, what really do they ever deliver, right? How do we understand the contribution of these agreements? And I really try to demonstrate in this book that we can, in fact, measure tangible outcomes from some cooperation efforts, not every cooperation effort, but particularly in the ones that I look at in detail, particularly those that have multi-year, multi-stakeholder investment. And I put forward some metrics that we can sort of use to help us measure the outcome of these different programs. And finally, I think it's important to note that for many decades, the cooperation with China, bilateral cooperation, was really aimed at sort of capacity building for China, right, in the clean energy and climate space. But this is really no longer the case. I mean, we have seen this shift where the knowledge and the know-how and the technology is no longer flowing just to China, but also from China, with China's really dramatic growth and experience in this sector and really in many ways leading the deployment of these technologies. This is, of course, shaping China's own science and technology strategy, as well as sort of China's role in the world in terms of its role as a science and technology power. So I just want to end with a couple thoughts. Some of us are here in Washington, and I think this is relevant to a lot of current policy discussions today. So just to pull out a few thoughts on this, and then happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. I think clean energy cooperation is a crucial component of the climate response, and it has led to important changes in China's domestic climate and energy policy. I think we are in a bit of a shift right now in climate policy towards national industrial policy strategies to address climate change, which I think is important, but this is a global issue. It ultimately does require a global response, and there is still an important role for international cooperation. I also think it's important to note that, this experience shows that fruitful cooperation with China is indeed possible, and even in the U.S. national interest, if it's designed to optimize political and technological benefit. We know how to do this. We've done this effectively in the past. And I find in my review that the most effective mechanisms leverage complementarities between countries, and they don't dismiss the risks. I think one of the reasons why the CIRC was effective was because it was recognized at the outset that intellectual property concerns could be a potential barrier to joint research and development. And so this issue was hit head on, and there was a lot of focus on this within the CIRC effort. Again, not to sort of, just push it aside, but to really understand how you could address this to make sure that the cooperation would ultimately be effective. And finally, we actually know how to design mechanisms for shifting geopolitical environments. And so I don't think that economic and security concerns should be a reason to halt cooperation altogether. I think we can be strategic and again, learn from past experience and be smart about how we design future cooperation mechanisms going forward. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. That was really interesting. And I have many questions, which I hope we'll get to, especially in terms of, how do we apply the lessons learned from the past in, today's world where the bilateral relationship is increasingly challenging to navigate. But let me introduce our panelists and ask them what they thought about the book and, how this relates to their knowledge and experience. We have a great group today. So let me start with Erica Thomas, the director of the Green Grid, an industry consortium dedicated to resource-efficient data centers. Erica is also senior director of policy, environment, sustainability, and regulatory for the Information Technology Industry Council, ITI. In this role, she runs the ITI's Energy Efficiency in Asia Pacific Environment and Sustainability Committee and co-leads ITI's Climate Committee. She joined ITI after a distinguished career as a U.S. diplomat, where she focused primarily on environment, science, technology issues and served multiple tours in China. We also have David Vance Wagner, Vice President for Strategic Partnerships for the Energy Foundation China. Before joining the foundation, he served as the China counselor in the Office of the Special Envoy for Climate Change at the U.S. Department of State, where he led U.S. China dialogue and collaboration on climate change and clean energy. Prior to the State Department, he co-led the China program at the International Council on Clean Transportation and served as the first and only foreigner at China's National Vehicle Emission Policy Research Center under the Ministry of Environmental Protection. And finally, we have Fan Dai, who is director of the California China Climate Institute at the University of California at Berkeley School of Law. Dr. Dai has played a significant role leading California's collaboration with China on climate, energy, and environment. She was appointed by Governor Jerry Brown as special advisor on China. She chaired the state's China Interagency Working Group and acted as the state's liaison on its critical economic and environmental initiatives on China. In 2017, she organized Governor Brown's trip, which resulted in a meeting with President Xi Jinping and the commitment to establish the California China Climate Institute. So we have a wealth of knowledge here on U.S. China relations and cooperation on climate. Let me start with Erica. You've had sort of a front row seat from the government's perspective, the U.S. government's engagement with China, many of these topics, and now from outside of the government, from more of an advocacy perspective. So how do you see, how have you seen the evolution of the collaboration on climate between the U.S. and China? How does the book resonate? And how do you see this to be important for understanding today's position on collaboration and the future of collaboration between the U.S. and China on climate?
Thank you. So the research in this book really resonated with me, and it clarified for me why things have changed so much from when I was working on these issues when I was in the government. So as you mentioned, I was at the U.S. Embassy. I was there from 2010 to 2014. I was Environment, Science, Technology, and Health Counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. And from 2006 to 2008, I ran our trade unit. And there, when I was in the trade unit, I was looking at the China's medium to long-term science and technology plan. And then when I was the ESTH counselor, I was overseeing many of our almost all of our bilateral cooperation on the wide range of science, technology, climate, and energy cooperation areas together, and collaborating with my colleagues in various sections on these issues. So during that time, and particularly in my the second tour when I was the Environment, Science, Technology counselor, I marveled at how science and technology cooperation could transcend politics. So, and I was struck how consistent and positive bilateral science and technology cooperation had remained despite the ups and downs in the overall bilateral relationship. So as hard as this might be to imagine today, I found an old speech of mine where I stated, and I'm going to quote here, "I like to brag that I have the world's best job. I work on the issues that are arguably the backbone of the U.S. China relationship. Why I say this is that the bilateral agreement on S&T was the first official agreement signed between the U.S. and China after normalization of relations in 1979. And over 30 years, the framework S&T agreement has branched out into hundreds of cooperation agreements between 25 technical agencies on the U.S. side and most of the technical agencies on the Chinese side. And my assessment wasn't just me, was backed up by many others, including the State Department's 2006 biennial report to the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission that stated, the S&T agreement has withstood the test of political turmoil and has provided a stabilizing influence on U.S.-Sino relations. Now, when I refer to my time in China, Star Wars comes to mind, because I feel like the distance between the situation today and just about 1 decade ago seems like a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And Joanna, I think your book is incredibly timely because it highlights the benefits of cooperation, just when the prospects for restoring it seem almost impossible, which is really terrifying if you think about it, because how can we avoid the dire consequences of climate change if the world's 2 largest greenhouse gas emitters don't cooperate to ensure that climate action is bold enough to achieve the Paris climate goal of limiting warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels? But unfortunately, as you point out in your book, climate and energy cooperation is rarely compartmentalized, and strains to the larger political and economic relationship can have direct implications for success of any climate and energy cooperative effort. And today, there can be no question that despite his very best efforts, U.S. climate envoy John Kerry has not been able to continue to compartmentalize climate and energy cooperation from the larger U.S.-China context. In his words, just last week, regrettably, in the last year, what was not supposed to happen has happened, which is the climate issue has gotten mixed up into all of the other tensions that exist between our countries. So your book, Joanna, provides a clear historical context and timeline of the changing nature of U.S. and China cooperation over time. You describe the model used for U.S.-China cooperation for the first 30 years, and then present the new models that have evolved over about the last 15 years. And by doing so, your book sheds light on why we were able to cooperate with China on S&T issues over 30 years, no matter the bilateral tensions in the broader relationship. But we're having such a hard time being able to do that today. So for the first 3 decades of the U.S. and China's collaboration on energy and climate, we operated under what you called the traditional model, or the north to south model, in which clean energy technology innovations from industrial countries, the north, are deployed in developing countries, the south. You then detail how over time, China's knowledge base and domestic capabilities grew, so that by 2009, China began cooperating with the U.S. and other developed countries on a more equal footing under what you call the new model and the future model. And as you described in your opening remarks, you talked about the specific, how that was deployed in CERC and the other research models that were much more dynamic and bidirectional. You describe how under the more dynamic cooperative models, China's domestic innovative capabilities played a role that had not existed under the traditional model. So my takeaway is that it is precisely because China has evolved from a technology recipient country in the traditional model to a technology innovating country in the new and future models described in the book, that it has become so much more difficult to isolate the energy and climate aspects of the relationship from the political and economic tensions than it was during the first 30 years after normalization. And now that China is a leader in many clean energy technologies, there's a broad understanding that its energy goals and capabilities are inextricably linked to its broader political and economic policy agenda. And that's why it's no longer easy to hive off climate and energy cooperation when tensions arise elsewhere in the relationship. So I want to thank you, Joanna, for providing such a clear description of how cooperation has and can work between China and other countries, and why there's so many areas where we can benefit from that cooperation and have benefited. And my sincere hope is that despite the many challenges in the way, that policymakers like John Kerry study your book and consider how the various models you described might be applied to restore this vital area of U.S. China cooperation, because the situation now is untenable. And I think the future of the planet depends on China and the U.S. collaborating to lead the world to a net zero future. So thank you.
Thank you, Erica. And I really appreciate you noting the change in China's role from in this sort of the structure, right? From north-south transfers of technology to China becoming an innovator, and how this may have contributed to many of the concerns and challenges that we see today, right? Let me move on to Vance and hear what he thinks, about the book and, how this relates to his work in government before and now, as a non-governmental actor. Vance.
Great. Thank you very much. Just want to confirm you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, yeah, thanks for inviting me, and it's great to be here. Happy Pi Day. It's March 14th today. Happy Pi Day to those who celebrate. Also, I want to say hi to Erica. It's great to see you. Thanks for mentioning that speech. I can remember you saying similar things 10 years ago when we were colleagues at the State Department, and I always value your insights. Hi to Fan, and of course, hi to Joanna. Congratulations on the book. It's important, it's timely. I think a lot of what I'm going to say and reflect on is consistent with what Erica said, but I think it's worth saying again. Look, just to start with, the book is an extremely rich resource to inform future engagement with China on climate and clean energy issues. It's a very valuable resource for those of us in civil society and philanthropy, academia, but also for the business sector or for those in government. So I do want to start by plugging the book, and I was not asked to say this, but I'd like to invite everyone watching this to go pick up the book and support Joanna and learn from it. So I just want to make 2 points here in this sort of opening reflection. I will speak mostly from a U.S. China bilateral perspective, which is what most of my experience has been in. But I do appreciate that the book does take a very global perspective and three very in-depth, interesting case studies, not just U.S. China. But the 2 points I want to make, the first point is I think the key question for us right now is not if we engage with China on these issues, but how we engage on these issues. And I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about this theme, right? So to start with, we should remind each other and we should remind the viewers that the magnitude of the climate crisis demands that the two countries, the United States and China, forge a path forward for continued engagement. So it's important to start from the challenge of the climate crisis and it being one of the defining challenges of this century for us to solve together as a sort of starting point for the critical importance of the US and China finding a way to engage on this issue. We're already seeing devastating effects globally from the existing warming that we've experienced, which is just over 1 degree, and the challenge that we face in the coming decades to decarbonize fast enough globally in order to achieve the Paris Agreement targets that Erica mentioned is enormous. Now, Joanna, you mentioned in your book that China and the United States are responsible for almost 40% of global emissions. So what this means is that there's no global solution to climate change that doesn't involve the active and ambitious participation of both of our countries. But it's critical to flag that it's not just because of the physical magnitude of both countries' emissions, right? So it's not enough to just say, okay, fine, China, you need to decarbonize in isolation. United States, you need to decarbonize in isolation, and that will be the solution. It's important to flag that China and the United States, because of our historical roles as the largest emitters, because of the U.S. role as largest developed country, China's role as largest developing country, those two countries play a very unique role and have a special responsibility in forging a global path forward for the rest of the world to follow. And the world expects this. The world longs for a vision, a joint vision from the two countries on a global solution to climate change. And I think we need to recognize that importance and that priority so that we can show joint leadership for the rest of the world and not ask the world to choose between the US and China. So my second point is that what this engagement looks like is not static. So the climate and clean energy engagement between the US and China has evolved over time, and it will continue to evolve. And this is a good and natural thing. And Joanna's book illustrates this extremely well, this evolution, right? She talks at length about it. It's a theme of the book. And it's important because I think sometimes there's a tendency for some pundits and politicians, especially now, to sort of have this attitude, well, this time is unique, right? Right now in the U.S.-China relationship, we're facing unique challenges and we need some extreme solution like, decoupling, or we need to put things on hold while we're sort of waiting for some, future improvement. And we're seeing this sort of rhetoric on both sides of the Pacific. My response would be to say, look, there have always been tensions and challenges in the relationship, right? And I absolutely do not want to discount the current difficulties in the bilateral relationship, which are very real and very hard, and they are new. But we should acknowledge that we have a long history of figuring out how to talk about these issues, even in the face of geopolitical challenges, how to share progress, how to compare notes on common challenges, how to build trust and confidence in each other's actions, and ultimately how to lead the rest of the world, all while protecting each other's national interests. And the organization that I work for, Energy Foundation China, we've been in China for almost 25 years. I'm happy to say Energy Foundation China referenced regularly through the book, so thank you, Joanna, for that. Fan's group is doing amazing work. Erica's group is doing work. Joanna, you've been working, with China for your entire career. we have a lot of history, we have a lot of experience, and that this book does a great job. Joanna, you did you talked about the data and the analysis in the book, but the thing I want to close with is the book in totality really invites the reader to reflect on this decades of engagement and come away with this much needed hopeful confidence that, hey, things are difficult, we're facing challenges, but we've done this before and we can do it again. So I appreciate that about the book and look forward to further discussion.
Thank you, Vance. And I think that's important. I mean, and I hope we'll have time to talk a little more about the practical or, what actually can be fruitful areas of cooperation in the future, right? Because sometimes we talk about cooperation, but it becomes hard to then pinpoint exactly what this could look like and how this can, function within the current environment where national security is obviously a big concern, right? But before we do that, let me turn to Fan, and I'm very excited to talk to you because you are still deeply involved. I mean, you are at the forefront of subnational collaboration with China. Given, the book is more focused on the federal level, national level collaborations, but obviously there's so much that's really important at the subnational level. And so hearing your perspective is really important for understanding better how this works in practice.
Sure, thank you. First, I want to make sure that you can hear me clearly as well. Okay, great, thank you. And again, congratulations to Joanna for the book. This is the book that I have been expecting for a long time. While I was actually doing my PhD study, I was hoping to find a book in this kind, but I wasn't able to. So really, I'm really happy to see, the book now is, comes out. And, I do want to share, I found it really actually hard to share anything in addition to what Erica and Vance has already laid out, but I would share my reflections anyways in a few aspects. So I think firstly, as you pointed out, in the book, there are challenges, and I really appreciate the view that you take, from a historical perspective. This lays out the history of decades of U.S. China and including not just the U.S. China, but also China engaging with other countries in energy and climate, collaboration or cooperation terms. And there are, ups and downs in different times. I think that historical view was really helpful. I actually recommended this book already to the students in my class that I'm teaching here, which I think would be a really informative and really helpful book for them to get a understanding and get a sense of how things been evolving in the past few decades. And again, I think from my career and my research and my work, I've always been really focused on subnational. So for me personally, I think it's really helpful to read this book and see this very comprehensive analysis on China's engagement with the U.S. and other countries. Particularly, I think the way, Joanna, you use the data in analysis, even lay out some metrics and measurement to evaluate the outcomes from those collaboration was really interesting. I've always wanted to find similar ways to evaluate the subnational, level of engagement, but I found it not easy to actually identifying those metrics and being able to come to some conclusions of how things worked or not. So I really want to praise that. I think that's a really good example for future studies in this kind, even looking at a different level of engagement. Secondly, I like to offer a comment on, in your book, I think the way that you explain, China used to be more as a recipient for, capacity building activities, and even with, the IPR protection and technology transfer, China used to be more as the, beneficiary, right, recipient of those activities. And in the case that you studied of Brazil and China engagement, I think that is a really interesting example explaining how China could actually export or, in another way to benefit other countries. And also in one of the chapters that you studied, the South Cooperation, I think that's a really a good example to give a more comprehensive understanding of how China actually positioned itself in those cooperation with outside. So it's not always the case that China has been getting all these technologies and getting the recipient of those activities, but in another direction, China could serve, and there actually is I think it's untapped potential for China to play a larger role in exporting its capacity, particularly in its renewable energy industries, to the global south. So I think that's a really, really good perspective, and actually helps to some extent balance the view of China's role in this global development of renewable industries. And I'm hoping, such examples could also inspire the policymakers in DC, at the national level of engagement, as well as the private sector, because I do think the private sectors could play a really constructive role in engaging, with China and with the developing countries in the South to enhance their capacity in renewable energy, as well as benefiting from those, transactions and especially the market. So I do think, worth highlighting private sector's role in this. And I think your book laid out a really, really good story, for China, Brazil, and the South-South cooperation, which could further being replicated in different areas and different countries. So I think that's my second comment. Lastly, I just wanted to mention this bilateral and multilateral dimension of cooperation. Oftentimes when myself being asked the question about, what do you think of the bilateral mechanism? Do you think that still works? How would we be able to, continue with what, during the Obama era, both countries were able to do? I want to echo, Vance's previous comments made about, I don't think we're at a time that we can afford to say, U.S. China should or should not or cannot collaborate with each other on climate. I think they have to, as the two biggest emitters. And really the question here is how do we find the most effective ways for the two countries to continue this engagement? And I like the way you, in the first 2 and 3 chapters, you lay out this, China and the U.S. as the G2, right? The global biggest two emitters, that they play a really vital role. But at the same time, China and U.S. also play an important role in engaging with other countries. That's kind of bringing the multilateral dimension. So I think in a way, I want to wrap up my comments is, we've been seeing a lot of development both on the U.S. side and on the Chinese side, and the mentality today. And I would echo, the two panelists already mentioned how difficult things are today about the bilateral relations. But I think, with the story that you revealed in your book, I think there are things we could still learn from the past, and we could still, design carefully mechanisms for the countries to continue with some of those exchange to the extent possible. At the same time, I would emphasize the importance for the U.S. and China, as you also laid out in your book, engaging with other countries from a multilateral perspective to forge this forward. So I think this is, again, really informative and very comprehensive summary of what things have worked and not worked in the past. And also, I like your recommendations that offer to the policymakers, which are really constructive. I'm looking forward to your further research on this, and I would invite everybody to pick up the book as well. I think I found it really worth reading and very informative. Thanks again.
Thank you, and thank you for pointing out the South-South cooperation element and China's potential role as a exporter as well of knowledge and technology, which I think is certainly it does complicate the picture as well, right? At the time in which many countries are trying to capture more of the economic benefits of decarbonization and maintain and keep them domestically, right? Reshoring, and you certainly see this in the U.S. and you see more and more conversations in Europe, but certainly even in other emerging economies, that it could actually even be a source of tension in some situations, right? So I think it's worth noting that some of these potentials area of cooperation can also have a different aspect. So, and which I think is where Joanna's points in her last slide, which I wanted to follow up on, about how the importance of structuring the collaboration in a way that is beneficial and can help national security and can take seriously some of the risks is really important. So I wanted to press you a little more, Joanna, and also everybody else, if you have comments on that, on how we can think about some of these tools and what really worked and how it can be applied in the future, and how you're thinking about this in the current environment.
Sure, and thank you everyone very much for your comments. The reason why I didn't write this book about just the United States and China, first of all, is because I think here in Washington, right, we tend to get very sort of siloed, right, and really focus on the dynamic, the bilateral dynamic, and rightfully so in many respects, but when we're talking about climate change, right, this is a global issue, as I think Vance and others clearly pointed out. And I think it's useful for us to remember that, while the U.S. and China are extremely important and the things that these countries do have global implications, we can't, there are many things that need to be addressed that go far beyond the United States and China. And I think the current policy discussions, which really are this sort of move away from a global and multilateral response and more towards this sort of domestic industrial policy focus, really, needs to consider the global repercussions of any domestic action, right? And so, as an example, if one country like the United States is thinking about, economic policy, trade policy, right, that will shift global supply chains in the clean energy space, the implications for developing countries in particular are going to be severe, right? And so we just have to get at this, open eye, really be clear-eyed about these implications, and be thinking about, again, it's not just about our relationship vis-a-vis China in the clean energy and climate space, but how our relationship affects the ability of the rest of the world to move forward in the low carbon transition, because ultimately, we need technologies to be deployed globally. And I try to demonstrate in the book, again, because China is so central in so many of these clean energy technology supply chains, but also just the experience, right? And I think Fan pointed this out as well, just the massive experience China now has with scaling renewables. It's really it's a laboratory of how we do gigawatt scale renewables that no other country has achieved, and the lessons learned there need to be learned by others who need to replicate this. So to get to your question, Ilaria, I think that we need to think about all this in designing any new bilateral cooperation mechanisms. I don't think the era of U.S. China cooperation is over. I think it is evolving, and will naturally evolve, just as it has, right, for many decades. And given the concerns about, S&T focused research, which, as Erica mentioned, is sort of used to be a very different world. It used to be sort of the safe harbor of, where the engineers were sort of together and not worried about the politics. And that really has shifted. And so I think now we do just need to be strategic about how we design these mechanisms for shifting geopolitical environments. But, my own takeaway is that doesn't mean like we stop all science and technology cooperation, because we just have to be smart about it. And it is in the U.S. national interest to do this. I mean, China is ahead of us in many ways, like it or not, and just have this experience. And many U.S. companies have directly benefited from scaling their technologies in China, working with Chinese partners. And again, you just have to be smart about this and design to mitigate risks. And again, hit them hit them head on, be transparent about them. And again, I think I show in the book how this has been done and can still be done going forward.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for reminding everybody that this goes beyond the U.S. China relationship, right? And certainly the book that goes beyond that as well. But in my research too, I've been very interested in the role of Chinese companies as they go abroad, right? And thinking about how to engage with them and what their role is in diversification of supply chains, right? Which is an objective that many countries are seeking, for example, to achieve is very important. And so I think. I completely agree that there needs to be a more nuanced approach to collaboration rather than simply dismissing it. Erica, we're almost out of time, but I would love to hear if Erica, Vance, or Fan have any thoughts on this.
I'm happy to jump in just quickly and just, I guess, reiterate what has been said time again. I think we're all on the same page, right? All of us who have been looking at this collaboration and what we know it has worked. I express appreciation for Joanna for getting this all down and putting it together to show that it can work. And I think, as you said, Joanna, like the key is you have to be strategic. But that it's too important not to figure it out. And so providing examples and where you can look at it and figure out how to do it. I just think we have no choice. So this is just an amazing resource to pick and choose what worked, when, where, and how. And maybe it looks very different than it did in the past. And so looking at these different models and you bring up, for example, ITER, like maybe it is more multinational or maybe it is more South-South. But at the end of the day, you have to find a way to do it and you have to be smart and strategic. And I think this book provides a great tool to start thinking about how to think differently so that we can find a way forward. So I'll just end with that. And thank you, Joanna, for the incredible resource that you've provided.
Maybe I'll just make one quick comment. We've talked a lot about the evolution of the engagement. And Ilaria, you asked sort of about more concrete things. So I'll say a couple things. We talked about one of the evolutions everyone mentioned was this evolution from sort of one-way transfer of information to China to now two-way, where China is as valuable a resource as any country, maybe even more valuable. But two others, recently I've been talking a lot about engagement as the next evolution of cooperation. And what that means is we have dialogue, trust building, information sharing, sort of creating the right foundation for either competition, either cooperation like we've done in the past, or maybe this new competition, sort of race to the top idea. But in order to have a sort of foundation for fairness in either of those, we need engagement and dialogue. And then the last thing, I think we're going to see an evolution. We have seen and are seeing an evolution from what I would consider like sectoral or like traditional topics of discussion, like transportation, power, industry, efficiency. Now we're seeing much more focused, not just multilaterally or bilaterally, but even domestically on cross-cutting and emerging issues. And this is really the challenge for the next decade, is how do we do long-term strategies? How do we work on just transitions, supply chains? How do we work with collaboratively with third-party countries, addressing emerging issues like methane, doing so engaging other actors like subnational and business actors. So I know that was a long list, but I think there's a lot of these emerging opportunities that we can build on with constructive engagement and learning from Joanna's book.
I just quick response. I mean, I think in some ways it's like going back to the fundamentals, right? Because in some ways this trust building is what we did, right, decades ago in the early years of this S&T cooperation. But I think that sometimes when things get derailed, you do need to go back to these fundamentals and remember sort of the origins of this relationship and the cooperation that it's been, built upon, but then use that to address these new emerging and increasingly complex issues.
Fan, do you have, yeah, please.
I'll just offer my quick final words. I think I agree. I think it's more like going back to the basics. We've been using the words coordination even, and I think it's the same thing as Vance talking about engagement. I think even though the two countries are competing with each other, compete to raise to the top and whatever, we need to still maintain this coordination to make sure that we're all heading into the right direction. And I think this book lays out really good structure of how things could still be done even in this very, very challenging geopolitics and landscape and difficult time.
Well, I think we're at a time, so we could keep talking about this, but I actually enjoyed that. Although I think our panelists are pretty much on the same page, I think we still learned something, which is sometimes difficult when everybody is exactly agreeing on everything. But I think that we have learned from today. I certainly learned that the idea of engagement and coordination, even while competing, is really important. And then also structuring and thinking seriously about where the risks are, while also enabling a better environment for cooperation, among many other things. But I would encourage everybody to look at Joanna's book, to read Joanna's book. But if you can't read it all, you should definitely look at it at least and buy it. I think we have a link on the event page, but you can also look it up on Google, I'm sure. And thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for Joanna. It was really informative, really interesting. And I hope we'll have more opportunities to discuss this further, because I think there's still a lot of questions in terms of exactly what spaces and what mechanisms we should be pursuing to try and maintain a fruitful cooperation or coordination at this point on climate between the U.S. and China, but also at the multilateral level internationally. So thank you everyone so much, and hope to have future events on this.